think it's difficult to me to think of consequences or solutions to problems in the world. It's hard for me to kind of take on that. I'd rather sort of illustrate present moments in between a moment where we can pinpoint maybe where we went astray, so to speak, and maybe potential for a new appreciation for where we are. I think it's maybe in the middle, the past and the future. It's maybe this like present kind of moment that I'm always thinking about.
Hello and welcome to New Editions, a podcast from the Studio Museum in Harlem. I'm Habiba Hobson, Senior Curatorial Assistant here at the museum and your host. In this series, we bring you conversations with artists whose work have recently joined our permanent collection. The Studio Museum in Harlem was founded in 1968 during an era of political and social turmoil. A group of diverse artists, community activists, and philanthropists came together to create a space in Harlem for artists of African descent, many of whom were not given attention within museums, commercial art galleries, and the larger art historical narrative. Initially, the museum did not collect works of art. Instead, it focused on providing studio space and educational programs for artists and the Harlem community. However, the founders soon realized the need for a collection that celebrated and drew attention to the contributions of artists of African descent. This historic decision has allowed us to build and care for works that tell the profound stories of our time. In this episode of New Editions, I am so thrilled to be speaking with Brandon Ndife. Brandon was born in Indiana and came to New York to attend the Cooper Union. He received his MFA at Bard College and has been living in New York ever since. Using primarily found objects, Brandon creates works that explore the relationship between decay and rebirth, and the natural and manufactured. Inspired by artists like Octavia Butler and David Hammons, Brandon is deeply interested in how class and social structure reflect and dictate all that we associate as important and worth holding on to. In this conversation, we speak about his early experiences with sculpture, as well as a turning point in his conceptual practice brought about when Hurricane Sandy hit New York. We also talk about his artistic influences and dream collaborations. More specifically, we delve deep into the new addition to the Studio Museum's collection, the sculpture titled A Master's Tools. On one side, the work resembles household furniture, maybe a small dining room table. However, at the object's longest edge is a gaping hole that exposes earth-toned items that appear similar to food and plateware. If you'd like to see this now, please press pause and look up this work on studiomuseum.org. Just search for Brandon Ndife. That's Brandon. Brandon, it's so wonderful to meet you. I would love to begin this conversation by first discussing your background in visual arts. What led you to painting and now to sculpture?
Yeah, I had a long journey here as a visual artist. I mean, it can go back as far as probably grade school age, honestly. I was always drawn to symbols and signs growing up. I was copying them in notebooks and things like that. But I think honestly, I really started taking it seriously in high school. I went to high school for the arts. So from high school, learning a lot about oil painting and just historical works and copying historical works, during school hours, it led me to New York, where I went to Cooper Union in 2009. And at Cooper, I had a really just interesting foundational year where I basically had a sculptor who was really interested in us not using the sculpture shop. So no tools, no fire, no hand tools, really taking a left turn into maybe what it meant to approach art in a very almost relational aesthetic, so to speak. So it was really prefaced on the immediacy of making work and more about the concept rather than the technique.
Mm.
So I really, yeah, that really has followed me in practice since, honestly, the way materials can maybe just be a conduit for the thought rather than maybe the other way around. You know, both are valid. I think both now have found their place in my work. But I think when I was an undergrad was really when I felt almost like this splash and this flash of the spirit, I
Mm.
guess to say, in the studio. Things from the heart, things that were made very quickly and meant a lot was kind of really where I started kind of identifying my own role, as an artist there.
Wow, thanks for sharing. That's so interesting that,
Mm.
you were sort of you were led on this journey and someone was put into your life to basically kind of share with you the ways in which you could use objects in your,
Yeah.
surrounding environment and sort of, yeah, sort of maybe ground it in the conceptual and in sort of the practical use of the material rather than the technique, even though the technique, I'm sure, is so much too central to your practice. That's
Yeah.
so interesting and like quite like some, yeah, divine intervention to
Totally.
say. Yeah. But that leads me so beautifully into my next question, which I'm just super fascinated by the way in which you work with domestic objects, items of the everyday. And, can we for a moment kind of talk about your relationship to objects, both
Mm.
acquiring objects, using them, those objects now perhaps not being for our use anymore and kind of going through a decay and then
Mm.
rebirth in which the way in
Yeah.
which you sort of reuse these objects.
I mean, excellent kind of segue, truly, because I think it was actually around that time when I was still in school when Hurricane Sandy happened in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this really interesting experience where, of course, the city was under this blanket of darkness and this duress of, this collapsed infrastructure, this megalith of New York, right? And it was completely shut off. But really, what drew me to these forms now was that I think it was simply, firstly, about kind of this voyeuristic way of seeing millions of people live in New York. I mean, we were all literally ushered outside because there was no inside was dark. And I think it was also that seeing people's belongings sort of pile up and gyre on the street was a really interesting experience to see the inner workings of the kind of labyrinth that we live in here in New York. And it was just really eye opening to see when this machine that we all kind of like help generate shuts down, you can really see infrastructure for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw so much potential in almost a metaphorical space as well, thinking of systems breaking down, thinking of substructure and the things that constitute a life also, I think is really the main takeaway from that experience and from since is really seeing the way in which I think about objects in the way that practitioners and believers of many faiths think of sacred objects or sacred relics or something like this. Like we come into our home, we take our jewelry off, we take our clothes, and we adorn them with our self, our psychological makeup, our literal makeup. Objects hold things that we, you know, put on and put on ourself with every day, right? And so to think of them as these blank drawers and mirrors and vanities and cabinets are, it's so much more loaded than that. They have the interior, right? These things that are maybe seemingly everyday or seemingly kind of innocuously like wood and MDF, all these materials, like we truly like imbibe them with spirit every day because it's our hands, it's our food, it's our clothes, it's our goods, it's our keepsakes. So all of these things to me, they really blend with us as using them, and they we rely on them for holding space. So for me, they're really charged in this way, where day to day we kind of reenact. It's a very ritualistic space, the home, right? So I'm always thinking of all the things that surround it, and the things that yes, that comfort us and nourish us. We put them places. I think it's a very human thing. And to me, to think about those things being juxtaposed with the natural world, it's, to me, not so far away from the sentience of nature as well. I think it's all kind of like a full circle in a very zoomed out way. So for me, I'm really interested in these objects as these standalone, almost analogs to people. And especially when, I think we might get into it a little later, when just infrastructures and overarching policies and programs that make it so that people don't have those things too. And I think about when there's an eviction, or when there's a fire, or when there's a flood, there's like a piece of ourselves, like a piece of someone. And then what happens, of course, the next cycle is what happens to the recycling of that. There's probably many things in our home that might be thrifted or vintage, and those are somebody else's bones in there. There's somebody else's memories and time with that thing. So I'm curious about these very jettisoned objects that actually, to me, seem really profound, like a historical record of time. When things in our bodies aren't here, you know, to me, it's a very nice conversation to think about the objects standing in place of us.
Totally. That's so thoughtful the way you describe your relationship. Thanks so much. Because yeah, as you were speaking, I'm looking in my room and even looking at my image in the screen and thinking about the ways in which these objects that I have and that I wear make up who I am. It's like kind of thinking through the ways in which, as you said, objects stand alone, as thinking about the way in which objects could perhaps stand alone as people. In many
Mhm.
ways, like my jewelry is a part of my identity. Like without my jewelry, I feel weird. I feel
Yeah,
not
yeah.
myself, that I'm missing something, that I'm not truly showing up as Habiba. And so,
Mhm.
and thinking about, when you move into a space and you have no things, it's like, oh man, this isn't a home, and
Right,
it's
right,
and the way in
right.
which that sort of fashions your, an idea of a space that's comfortable, that can serve to nourish us.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's just super, super interesting, and I feel like I haven't really thought about objects in this deep of a way. And your practice, I think, does that so beautifully, and also thinking through the way in which it kind of takes on like natural and organic forms
right.
and man-made forms too. And so leading me to my next question, I wonder, like, in doing so, and sort of in fusing the natural, the organic with the more man-made, how do you explore interconnectedness and human impact on the environment in your practice? I mean, I think a word that came to mind was mycelium when I think of your
Mhm.
sculptures, the way in which sort of the interconnected web of life that
Yeah,
makes up, who we are, and what plants are, and mycelium as just being a very, very natural part of the way things grow. But yeah, I'm just curious too about like how you also too might think about human impact on the environment in your practice, and the ways in which we are in a sort of a disastrous relationship
yeah,
with the environment.
totally. I mean, so many of those things, so many of those like kind of intersections are what I'm exactly thinking about. I mean, I think, and one level, it's just very obvious that there is a multitude, maybe even like a too much, over ripening of things out in this world, out in this earth. I think that's just can be said as a given that there's just a surplus of things. And then I think with that, it's a funny kind of irony that so many people don't have things. So already there is like this kind of discrepancy that it's so plainly seen, and so obviously very felt. there's a sort of a crisis of how to get people things, like they're the essentials. And so I think for me, in a very like, yeah, metaphorical sense, it's like I'm always thinking of, you know, these jettisoned objects as these analogs to like jettisoned people. There's so many kind of isolated experiences of not having enough, or there being a open open source, open sort of secret, or almost like elephant in the room with discrepancy of having and not. So I think one level is that. And then you mentioned a lot of the organic forms in this kind of natural kind of world that exists in these very plain and everyday objects. But to me, those conversations sort of harken back to the life cycle again. I think when things are isolated and over time take on a environment at this point, it's the underbrush or this almost like new colony of potential or a new way forward almost to think about, you know, what happens after, not necessarily a consequence of where we are. I don't think it's, I think it's difficult to me to think of consequences or solutions to necessarily like problems in the world. It's hard for me to kind of take on that. I think I'd rather sort of illustrate present moments in between a moment where we can pinpoint maybe where we went astray, so to speak, and maybe potential for a new appreciation for where we are. I think it's maybe in the middle, the past and the future. It's maybe this like present kind of moment that I'm always thinking about. And I think that goes along with how I'm thinking of the technique of how I make my work. There's a lot of processes that are very separate from the final sculpture, whether that is the steps of casting, you know, objects first and then painting them, and then the third thing or multiple others that lead to a thought or the sculpture itself not really revealing where it started or ended.
Yeah.
It's maybe feeling very like frozen in place. And I think that in a way is for me the moment of pause that I'm looking at when I'm just walking down the street. It's just a moment of very curious, like, well, damn, like this is maybe where it come to, or maybe, damn, like I can maybe glean what happened here just by nature of like the set of assumptions and the set of truisms that I can just feel as an active citizen, right? And I think when I'm in the studio, I'm really thinking of like all of us, and what us is neither here nor there, because I think that I preface some context for those who maybe can feel it stronger. And I think from there it becomes more universal. But in the end, I think I'm always talking to people who can maybe feel that they have some resonance, and even a simple part of the sculpture, like, that green reminds me of my grandma's cabinet, or, you know, I have a similar looking thing in my house, like, or that looks like my under my sink. You know, it's these common experience. I think it's more about the experience a lot of times in the end when I'm in the studio of what could possibly feel like getting the sculpture or seeing where I'm coming from. In fact, maybe the goal is to maybe think of it as like, especially using like the aforementioned techniques, that like this is actually a found thing, but it's actually rendered very, hopefully very carefully as, you know, something from scratch. You know, it's maybe the thought that can feel like the audience could have made that, happen. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And I'm so happy that you touched upon your process because I think your process, especially for the work in our collection, I would love to sort of dig into a bit. And if you wouldn't actually mind, maybe walking us through your process for creating this work
Yes.
in whatever, however many details you want to share. But yeah, if you could sort of just talk through like what is it that we are looking at here?
So this piece is called A Master's Tools, and this quote coming from Audre Lorde here, but basically, I have thought about the ways in which like infrastructure and systems of obviously in oppression and inequality have really led to many in this country, not only Black people, but us being the workers, the builders, the cooks, the cleaners, the help, all of this sense to build our lexicon and histories of art and architecture and all of these marvels that we have, but the hands that went involved into the making of it are very much the invisible ones. And so when I'm thinking now of the composition, these innards of like specific foodstuffs that are cast and painted, like these yams and wild gourds and squashes, these indigenous foods, these indigenous hands, these cuisines that have fed, our historical forefathers. Those are the tools. Like those are actually the tools. It's the natural world that feels to me as the maker a lot of times of several generations of this country since the beginning. So to me, the inner growth always find these nooks and crannies in my work because those feel like that's the germination, that's the seed, that's the true seed. So to me, they spill out in this way to almost be illustrating almost the shame that designated to our natural world and the ones that came before us, the resignation to the background, the inside, the secret kept inside, to describe a lot of what is the built world or man-made to this day. And I think the systems that dictate where we live, how hot it is, what's grown, are all these hyper objects that are working from above that create the landscape that we have now. So I think to me, it's all sort of this idea almost of like these jettison objects, these found objects are almost products of the planned obsolescence that we are under. So, to work very inwardly, almost to the atomic level, then to really blow it back out to these larger themes is something I really grapple with how to really tackle. And so I typically really refrain from using a lot of figure and a lot of kind of human touch to things. I think standalone objects can really describe a lot of these complications really clearly without having the body really be this kind of conduit, because it's a lot more nuanced. I think to me, think just about people. There's so many systems that work before it and on such larger scale that to me, it feels like tools aren't only used by oppressors on bodies or on the human body. I think it extends, of course, to the natural world and consequences and then conclusions that we will yet to be seen. But like, yeah, I think it takes these objects a lot of time to accumulate this kind of scale to me. So working with a lot of textures and a lot of processes that need time to solidify is really where I approach like the studio from. Like, I know that there's a story told with how long it takes for a generation to kind of reach literally an epoch or an era. So it really is about time for me with all these things, because it generates itself through history.
Awesome. And thanks so much for sharing more about, the the process for creating this work, but then also the title too, because I think in many ways
Yeah.
your explanation just so, I think, beautifully captures like the experience of the work itself, encountering like this really, really beautiful object. I think there's an aspect to, your work that I would group in beauty as being sort of central to the works that you
Yeah.
create, but then coupled with this sort of like, showing us about the inner gizzards of society, of the sort of the uglier, sort of more hard to explain, murky, thick, complex, coated in stuff types of the way in which
Yeah.
we live amongst each other. I think in a 2022 interview with Chris Molnar in Bomb Magazine, you shared
Mhm.
that, quote, I have an intense desire to work on a film set. From a sculptural context, I think my approach is well suited to illustrate a story. I have worked previously with fellow artists, writers, and poets in collaboration in further illustrating my ideas, pushing past just the physical sensory experiences in a typical gallery setting. I want to be
Mhm.
able to use sound, lights, and other filmic components in work moving forward, which I thought was so interesting. I'm so curious to
Yeah.
hear about like these, interdisciplinary interventions, inspirations. Curious,
Sure.
if you can share more about, and if you want to call out specific writers, visual artists, performers, filmmakers that you would include in your artistic bibliography that you'd include in a future work, or if perhaps you want to share more about the ways in which you have pushed past the physical sensory experiences. I sort of leave it up to you to answer as you
Sure.
wish and be as detailed as you'd like.
Sure. I mean, I have taken so much inspiration, I think, from the written word and also, the cinematic universe. I think the world in which I'm always thinking about, it always exists somehow a little easier in fiction and a little bit more legible in a even science fictive way. I think the first time I read Octavia Butler, I think very so many fans of hers, I don't know, are out here. But I think the first time I picked up Bloodchild, I think it was very much like, wow, this is someone who, yeah, just like really gets the way in which so many genres that have come before that deal, especially with the Black experience,
Mm.
can really like find a home and find a new fresh. I One thing I always thought about her writing was that it was just her stories were very fresh. There wasn't a way for me, I think, before reading her work to really think about like, wow, like I'm feeling all these things about like just my family and my friends and where we live and like how crazy it is, the things that we see every day. And, you know, to really think about, oh, wow, the analog is that it's sometimes so bewildering to be alive in America that it truly feels like fiction. Um, so it was really that was really and still like really inspiring to me. And I think from a very practical way, in a very like tactile way, really thinking about how, films like, the auteurs of like David Cronenberg, and thinking of, the practical effects that he was really using in preface in a very fictive way, but like in a way, and even some of the stories felt like they really matched how his sets were on set, and really just, yeah, finding a lot of inspiration in that way, watching a lot of just like science fiction films. But, truly, I think it still comes down to like other artists who really like find kindredship with. And, a big one always is David Hammond's. I think about the setting of the gallery a lot. And I think about the setting of institutions that we have just prescribed to be white walls, and how that's almost not enough a lot of times to really convey and then imbue, you know, the potential of like bringing a huge idea like the earth and its things together. And I think a lot about treatment of my work too. It's very much like like really adorned with like dust and particular paints and layers. And I think about how the stage and like maybe expanded total control of the exhibition could really be felt in that way, in a very like just intrinsic to the fiber of like what is being shown, really soak it with like all of the other peripheral phenomenological components of space that exhibitions and typical just like showings of work don't really have time to really feel. They don't have time to really season in that way. And that is kind of the a big dream. Lucky enough to work with an amazing curator at Storm King, this outdoor sculpture museum of sorts. Basically, working outside for the first time really felt like that was one kind of segue that like truly met that feeling I'm speaking of. Is that work was up for many months, but as the work kind of adjusted and worked into the seasons, it really changed the composition of the piece. And that kind of exposure just to the elements really is a lot of what I mean. The collaboration with like time and space is like, would be really wonderful in like a really expanded way.
Yeah, just like in many ways that sort of the setting of the landscape with the light and the darkness and the clouds, really sort of set a sort of a stage, which was
Yeah.
so beautiful. And also too, as you were talking about sort of sets and plays and whatnot, I was thinking about the German dancer and choreographer Pina Bausch, whose works, if you're familiar, are where the setting, the set itself is so important to choreography, to the piece itself. And so, there's there's a work that she has with a bunch of chairs all everywhere, and there's like a couple dancing between the chairs, and that then becomes part of the choreography itself. Is that the sort of the spatial limitations that are imposed on them is essential to the act of dancing in it, but also of viewing the work itself. Right. It's quite loud, it's quite intense. It's cacophonic. It's like all the things. So. Yeah, so also beautiful. Interesting to see the ways in which, like, you would perhaps your work perhaps activate choreography as well.
Love that. Yeah.
Walk me through your version of a morning. How do you start your day?
Yeah, my mornings usually are waking up by the window. The sun is definitely getting me up. I usually get up around like 7:45, 8. Wash my face, brush my teeth. And then usually, so in my home, I do a lot of actual small work, small sculptures or small drawings that are kind of littered around my house. And I'm sort of in the morning, I can walk and sort of like do a little here, do a little there. It's like almost like a little.
I love that.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's like walking around and like dusting all your stuff off or something. It's like a small ritual. Just like, I have a piece of paper here. I'm like maybe drawing it for a little like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then like the other one is over there. And like maybe do that one for 5 minutes. Yes.
It's amazing.
So yeah, and maybe lasts until around like 10 o'clock or so. And then usually so when I get to the studio, I mostly am just writing stuff down as accomplishments rather than this is going to be a start to finish thing, or like I'm going to start a sculpture. Like it's more about like make one adjustment, or like the notes in the studio are like more red or like, too high, it's more like, okay, that's too high. I was thinking about it all yesterday. Like, I'm going to cut it, or like this too wide. It's more of like, at first it's very broad things that I'm like, I need to get into, or like this sculpture needs, or this painting needs. It's more of like, too, like, this color is too black, or like this is too, like, it's, yeah, it's maybe more describing like what its silhouette maybe is doing, rather than like, I need to paint the side more, and maybe more like paring down from like, yeah, just the silhouette of something, or its shape. If it feels like real to me, if it's like, this table is like, it's like too high, this wouldn't be a table. Like, I may be more on that stage at this point, and then later on it'll be about like, okay, we're going to paint this now, or we're going to strengthen its body, or like, now we're going to put the mud or put the soil on it. So I'm in the studio a lot, looking more than doing a lot of times. It's more about looking at it, sketching it, maybe feeling like this has a good shape, rather than like, I'm going to finish it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually spent a lot of time just kind of looking at stuff that I'm making, rather than like really acting on it. Just to take notes, like really describe it. And then yeah, so around this time I'm sort of here doing like emails and cleaning up. I think that's a big activity, actually, is like sweeping. Like, I find a lot of ideas. I get a lot of ideas by like cleaning up, actually.
Mm.
Uh, I think it helps me see a little easier, like what's happening in the studio, like cleaned up a bit. Um, and then yeah, if not too much else is going on, I'm like a morning person, so I usually don't stay super late
Mm-hmm.
in the studio. I'm usually here until like 6, 7.
Okay, great.
Yeah, yeah,
Funny you mentioning cleaning because your text for my zone at Bureau, I think like
yeah,
the first word was like about cleaning and how you're always cleaning up.
yeah, yeah,
That's
exactly.
great. Yeah, 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 yeah.
No, totally. It's a big part of it. Yeah.
Huge, huge.
Yeah.
This next question you kind of answered, but yeah, maybe there's something else you want to share about like
Mhm.
what's a dream project or activity you would take on if,
Oh yeah,
with like with access to sort of like unrestricted funds.
totally. I think in a large way, honestly, like a big dream is to actually have. I mean, there's so many, and I feel like it's its own industry at this point. But it's actually to have like I'm so interested in the way in which like found objects and like furnitures like can exist again. Like, actually, a big project is to kind of almost have like a store, to actually like have sort of like a not-for-profit space, or some kind of like, yeah, some kind of, not a Salvation Army, but like in a way in which like, yeah, kind of like a store in which like one can, a funny thing that I always think about in the world, especially like with this project, is like the fact that like rent centers exist,
Mm.
and like how you can rent basically your home. Like, you can be renting furniture and be renting semblances of like normalcy with, objects and like household furnitures, and that like how on the forefront those things are actually very predatory towards people, is that like they hold you on credit, and you're basically like using your credit card to be doing these things that so many people can't do, that because they obviously don't have credit cards and bank accounts. And so was always trying to collapse away in my head of like, wow, wouldn't it be so cool if like you could rent some things like this, but it's not based on income or credit, or if there's a better way in which like people who live under public housing can like have the flair of like variety and taste, rather than like these very like basic things that just come with the apartment, or like things that aren't able to be inherited in that way. So, I always think about like just things that are on the street, like being able to like, I don't know, have a system where people can like learn how to refurbish furniture, and like when they're done, like you get to keep the thing. So it's like if there was like a program in which like, yeah, and especially in like just, lower income communities, obviously is where we're speaking of. And so really coupling many things like skills, but also like goods is like, yeah, something I've always thought about.
So interesting. Yeah, it's like a almost like a space where things, yeah, perhaps like a Salvation Army, but then like with like a workshop space for
Yeah.
folks to work with people that can help them help themselves in a way,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
so
Very much that.
so cool. Just
Yeah.
great. This
Yeah.
last question before I ask you to ask
Hmm.
us the question. This last question is from Zora J. Murph, who was the previous
Hmm.
interviewee, and he asks, "How are you gassing yourself up right now? How are you turning the volume up? How are you getting in your bag?"
Yes. Yes. Felt. Love that question. Honestly, it's like, the one big thing about gassing yourself up, I think, is that, is to remind yourself. I think that's a big part of like confidence and just getting swag back. It's just like really looking back at like truly how far you've come and what you've already done, which is like if you just isolate purely objective things and just really say like, wow, you really did that. Like you really did that. Like you really did a lot, it's like, it's really amazing to just, and I don't do it enough. And that's like truly, I've been really just been more mindful about like, when times are stressful and people from outside can be like, you're killing it. Like you're really doing it. Like it's so important to really like remind yourself, like you've come so far. Like you're really doing a lot. Like you're doing great. And so that's a big one. That's a big one. Been really just looking back at things just in picture form, being like, wow, like that really happened. Like that wasn't even that long ago. Like it's a really big thing, So that's really gonna be like something that I even carry over, like not just recently, but I think that's just really a tool to keep in the back pocket always. It's just like take your flowers, like really take your break and be like, wow, you really did that. Like like amidst so many other things that were going on in your life. Like you really ate. So it's like, and I think also it really helps to gas myself up when I see just mutuals kill it. It's huge. It's so sick, but like to really show up for mutuals who are really doing it, and it's just like wow, like later on we're gonna be in the same conversation. Like it's gonna be so amazing. Like it's so cool. It's really great to I was at the new residence they're opening at
Oh, yeah.
PS1, and I was like, oh Jeffrey, like Devin, like you guys are killing it. Like, look at this. Look at people. Look at my mutuals. Like, they're killing it.
Yes.
And Charisse too. Just met Charisse, but I was like, damn. Like, everybody's like such a star. Like, it's amazing. And like, that's truly the one. It's just like to look back and also just to like look around.
And to place yourself in that too, in that stardom, it can
100%.
so hard, but like, yeah, celebrating the big ones, but also like the small ones too,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. The small ones, really, though. Truly. Like, truly, truly. Like, the
Mm.
small ones that you're just like, wow, I just had to get through that. Like, if you didn't do that, just that big thing couldn't happen. Like, it's,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Celebrating the things that no one saw, that no one
yeah,
witnessed. It's just you. So, oh,
big
wow.
time.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
Beautiful
yeah.
question, Laura. Thank you.
Boy, of course.
And then just lastly, can you please share one question that you'd like for me to ask the next artist?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this, and like, there's a real schism happening right now, very live, real time. I think in the art world, obviously, no exception. But like, I think this conflict with our brothers in Palestine and in Israel, not to really touch on it, but I think not we're not very special that like a conflict is happening in the world while we're existing as artists and creative people. I think that is just life. That's the world. I think all generations before and those probably after will deal with real life things that are going on. And, it's times like this, honestly, that like truly, I think non-creatives or non-creatives, but I think us as creatives, we are always later on looked at as like, wow, we really look to them as the ones to move or describe or like just elucidate like what we're going through as a people. I think people really look to creatives to maybe like make sense or nonsense of it. And I think we're privileged to like really feel that and be able to like put things out into the world in that way. But, I think my question is always about, and especially in these times, like, as artists, have you changed a mind yet? Have you gotten a guttural response from something or someone? Has someone given you? Have you touched someone recently? Has something been felt by someone from your work recently? And also like another another sub question or like a part two is that like, but is that our job?
Is that the point? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oof. Man, that question touched me. I swear. Because that's a beautiful question. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that ensues. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation between me, Habiba Hobson, and artist Brandon Ndife, whose sculpture, titled A Master's Tools, was just added to our collection. The Studio Museum in Harlem is the nexus for artists of African descent locally, nationally, and internationally, and for work that has been inspired and influenced by Black culture. It is a site for the dynamic exchange of ideas about art and society. We invite you to get to know our collection and follow along on our journey to building our new museum in Harlem. For more information on Brandon and all the artists in this series, you can visit studiomuseum.org. You can access these links and more in the show notes. My name is Habiba Hobson, Senior Curatorial Assistant here at the museum and your host. New Editions is produced by Sound Made Public with Tanya Katengian, Philip Wood, Alessandro Santoro, and Jeremiah Moore. This podcast would not have been possible without members of the Studio Museum's curatorial and communications departments, especially Curator Connie H. Choi, Associate Director of Digital Marketing and Communications Shauna Kudowitz, Managing Editor Meg Whiteford, and Director of Marketing and Communications Isida Jansene. Special thanks to Senior Director of Learning and Engagement Shanta Lawson and Director of Education Chloe Hayward. Much gratitude to Studio Museum donors and patrons, particularly those who purchased or gifted works for the Studio Museum's collection that are featured in this series. Our theme music was created by Mandingo Ambassadors. The cover image was created by Studio Museum's senior graphic designer Megan Tatum. To learn more about this series, please visit studiomuseum.org/magazine. And please share this conversation, write a review, follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.